put together another one, trying to think about the future next steps, what happens vis-a-vis especially the US policy, because there's been a lot of back and forth between Turkey and the United States. As you know, we are going through one of the most Turkish relations because of multiple variety of different crises and issues between the two countries, including Syria. But today, we will obviously talk about that, but we want to try to see where US policy, or for some analysts, non-policy, where it's headed, and what we could expect. As you know, withdrawal did not fully materialize. Some US military is back in certain parts of northern Syria, and there's a deal between Turkey and US, as well as there's a deal between Turkey and Russia. So there's a lot of things going on, and there are many moving parts to this, but I trust that my great panelists, excellent experts on these topics, will enlighten us and take us through the issues and try to provide perspective on US policy on Syria. Just to my left, we have Mona Yacoubian. She's a senior advisor for Syria, the Middle East, and North Africa at the United States Institute of Peace. Thank you, Mona. And just to her left, Luke Coffey is director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And just to his left, our Dr. Kanat is our research director here at SETA. So I'll give 3 to 5 minutes for introductory remarks to my panelists, and then we'll move forward. And I've already asked Mona to sort of talk to us about US's goals about stabilization and reconstruction. Those were especially particular areas that she focused on in her past work on at the USIP, and also address other issues. Of course, we're going to talk about that. But please go ahead, Mona. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Kadir. Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So I guess what I would start by saying is it's very hard to conceive of U.S. policy today without talking about everything that has transpired, beginning with the October 6th phone call between President Trump and President Erdogan, because that call essentially set in train a series of events. We don't have to go all through them, but that have more or less, I think, upended U.S. policy in Syria. And I think particularly with respect to the work that was being done in northeast Syria, the United States, with its partners on the ground, its local partners on the ground, the Syrian Democratic Forces, that work is now essentially been completely undone, or is in the process of being undone by the series of events that have taken place since the call. In particular, I would highlight, it's very hard to talk about stabilizing areas when we have now live conflict, active conflict going on certainly in this northern zone that goes 30 kilometers deep. There are continued reports of violations of the ceasefire that has taken place. There are deep concerns about the behavior of Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army forces, Syrian forces on the ground, the commission of abuses and so forth. There's been significant displacement. Over 200,000 people have been displaced from that area. Many of them have fled into northern Iraq. Just on the phone with our USIP team in Iraq this morning, and I believe the numbers right now are around 14,000 Syrian refugees who have come into Iraq as a result of the violence. So it's very important to underscore the broader context in which we are talking about questions like stabilization. Reconstruction, honestly, has never really been in the cards. The United States has a fairly strong position against funding reconstruction, even under the best of circumstances in Syria, certainly in any areas that are under the Assad regime's control, but even beyond that, because of the fatigue in our country for funding massive amounts of reconstruction. So our focus has been largely on stabilization. And in this regard, again, stabilization in the Northeast primarily focused on areas liberated from ISIS. Here, I think there are also issues with this new residual force that is remaining. Still much more clarity needed on the exact mission of the force. It is supposedly now to protect oil. Where exactly the force is deployed, as of now, it looks like in and around Deir Zor, as well as up in Heseke, where there's another important oil installation. But these areas don't coincide directly with where the most important stabilization activities need to take place. In addition, work on governance and restoration of essential services. All of this, it's hard to imagine how that kind of work can continue, given the uncertainty of both where the U.S. forces are, the uncertain security environment. The U.S. Start Forward team, which was the civilian sort of forwardly engaged expeditionary component to our work on the ground, that component has been pulled back. So that too undermines efforts at stabilization. And the composition even of this new force. It's got heavy mechanized, Bradley fighting machines. It's National Guardsmen as opposed to the seasoned special operators who had been working in these areas and working closely with local Syrian partners on the ground. So I guess for me, bottom line is, in light of everything that's happened, it's really very difficult to see how the U.S. can move forward in any sort of constructive way with these the long-standing agenda of stabilizing areas that had been liberated from ISIS.
All right. I have questions, of course,
Okay.
but we'll come back to you. Luke, please.
Great. Thanks, Kader, for inviting me to speak here today on this issue. I will try to keep my remarks brief so we can have more of a discussion later. I'll focus on looking forward, what the U.S. should be doing, and I'll highlight 5 main goals for the U.S., in my opinion, going forward. I mean, we can have a discussion about how we got to where we are. Most people, I think, know my views very well. I was an outspoken critic from the very, very, very beginning about arming the YPG. And I knew that someday it was all going to end in tears, and here we are. But going forward, there are things that the U.S. can do to make sure it is able to meet its national interests in the region and its security objectives. The first one is, the first goal should be to make sure that the U.S. homeland and the homeland of our allies and partners are safe from transnational terrorism originating from northeastern Syria, right? So this means improving our capacity building among countries in the region to help fight counterterrorism operations. This means a better cooperation between law enforcement at all levels of government. This means better intelligence sharing. This means having a better idea on who's coming in and who's coming out of the region. This doesn't necessarily mean having a large U.S. military presence in northeastern Syria. There are ways to keep us safe at home that don't require a large U.S. military presence on the ground in Syria. So I would say the protection of the homeland and the defense from terrorism of our allies is the number one overarching goal for the U.S. as it pertains to Syria. The second is to contain the civil war inside Syria's borders. There is nothing the U.S. can do right now to engineer an outcome to the Syrian civil war that we could be satisfied with. The civil war has been going on for too long. It has been rotting and festering for too long. We need to understand the limitations of our power and influence. And just because there is a civil war somewhere in the world doesn't mean the United States has to pick a side. And there is nothing we can do to engineer an acceptable outcome. So our goal should be to contain it inside Syria's borders as much as possible, so we don't have a repeat of what happened in northern Iraq when ISIS was on the march towards Baghdad. And this means investing in our partners in the region, Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, to make sure that they have the capabilities to ensure that this stays contained inside Syria's borders. The third goal for U.S. policy going forward should be helping to alleviate the humanitarian disaster that's in the region. The goal of the United States in terms of support towards refugees should be to keep the individual displaced as close to his or her homeland as possible. Now, this isn't always possible, but that should be our aim. And we should help countries that have carried a tremendous burden in terms of refugees, such as Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq, deal with this and help manage the suffering that's a result of the civil war. The fourth goal should be to encourage regional countries to have more ownership, have a bigger stake in the future of Syria. And this ties into Turkey's very ambitious plans to secure its southern border with Syria. This also ties into the lack of willingness for most of the Arab world to lift a finger when their backyard is burning. But yet the United States is expected to come in and try to solve this problem that we simply can't do. And there's no moral obligation to do what you can't do. So we can try, we can help our allies and help our friends, but unless there's more local ownership, unless there's more regional ownership, then the U.S. is going to be limited in what it can ultimately achieve. And the fifth is it's time for the U.S. to realign its geopolitical posture more in line with the national security strategy, which is that of great power competition. We have this ability to take a tactical setback and turn it, or we have this ability to take someone else's tactical victory and make it our strategic defeat. Whoever owns that military base in Manbij, that is strategically irrelevant. Okay, the optics look horrible. As a U.S. Army veteran myself, seeing that video of those Russian mercenaries, contracted civilian security officials going through that U.S. forward operating base and filming it was frankly embarrassing. But if you look at the bigger picture, call me whenever there's a Russian flag flying over the U.S. base in Poland, okay? We need to start realigning ourselves for the big power competition against Russia, against China, against Iran, as outlined in the national security strategy. And this means repairing our relationship with Turkey. We need to figure out, both sides need to sit down and figure out how we're going to get this relationship back on track, because the status quo is not sustainable. It only, in the long run, will harm transatlantic security. And frankly speaking, it'll undermine Turkey's security and stability as a regional player. This rapprochement between Erdogan and Putin goes against the natural grain of history. And the US and other Western allies need to work more closely together, and then with Turkey, to figure out how we're going to patch this up and start moving forward. Because right now it's not helping U.S. interests in the region for sure in terms of the great power competition. So I'm sure I said enough there. That will spark some questions or some debate, and I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, definitely. Kılıç.
I will keep it short as well as the other two panelists. And it is becoming really hard to talk about the U.S. foreign policy in Syria. It has been now almost 8 years. And I work on this topic. I wrote a book on this topic. And foreign policy crises are the sexy topic for the foreign policy analysts to write, to see the divergence of interest, to see the interagencies. However, when the crisis is going on for not 13 days, but for 8 years, it becomes really complicated. It was the situation during the Obama years. We see a president and his inner circle that doesn't want to get involved or not to have any intervention in Syria, regardless of the humanitarian disaster over there or the geopolitical ramifications after the Russian intervention to the region. And we had this bureaucracy preparing different plans to intervene to Syria, arming and training and arming some rebel forces, trying to find a solution, political solution in Geneva 1 and Geneva 2, a serious political solution for this, and thinking about the potential humanitarian outcomes of this crisis. And now we have the mirror image of that. It is president who wants to leave Syria, and we see a whole bureaucracy and whole group of people in Washington, D.C. who are willing to stay in Syria regardless of what happened. But we again see something very unique that happened for the last 8 years. There is a lack of strategy. And this strategy is reflecting itself in the number of goals and objectives that United States is basically stating either through President or the Secretary of State when Tillerson made this speech about the 5 points about the Syria. We keep hearing the different objectives, and those objectives are revolving and evolving. But we don't see a policy, we don't see a whole amount of strategy that will make those things happen. We see that there is if we have this panel 2 years ago when Tillerson made his first speech, it was last year, Tillerson made his first speech about the Syria and 5 objectives. Iran became one of the most important issue for US Syria policy to stop the spread of the Iranian proxies in the Middle East. However, we don't see an investment over there as a strategy that will make that thing happen. We see a lot of people, just like Luke mentioned, that Russian intervention in Syria became a major topic. Russia is now considered, when you read those alarmists, you see that Russia is now the real power broker in the Middle East. United States lost all of the leverage in the Middle East. There is those concerns, but we don't see again the strategy actually how to stop Russia in the region. So there are 2,000 troops. There is a very limited goal and mandate of stopping this, the ISIS or now the enduring defeat of ISIS. But we don't really have a strategy that will stop Russia in Syria if there is any willingness to do that, if this was an objective. Again, we see the goals like stabilization of Syria or somehow reconstruction that will take place in the next maybe 10, 20 years. But we again don't see that investment that will make actually that policy goal to be a strategy that can be applied in Syria at this point. So we keep hearing the same discussions in the Washington, D.C., whether the debate is basically, should United States be more involved in Syria or not? And in the last debate, what we see is there is a group called YPG, and as other panelists mentioned, the relationship was from the beginning was a broken relationship, although it was at the beginning it was stated a temporary, transactional, and limited tactical relationship between United States and YPG. Everybody in this town who work on Syria have at least some opinion that this relationship would create a major problem for not only for the US-Turkey relationship, but also the situation on the ground. And since then now, it has been almost a month that the Turkish operation started. We see that the relation between Turkey and United States had major hits. There are significant crises. And there is, again, an ambivalence in Washington, D.C. about what will be the goal of United States in Syria. And now the goal evolved as oil. And we don't know what that means. Truly, I didn't understand what the oil means. Those oil resources, as far as I understand, is not that lucrative to help the reconstruction of Syria. Correct me if I'm wrong. And we don't know what will be the mandate of the US forces that were sent to Deir ez-Zor. So who are, there is this idea of continuing the ISIS campaign and preventing the oil fields to be in the hands of the ISIS, but we don't know what will be the policy outcome of this, what will be the larger objective of United States, and we keep hearing the same kind of discourse that the oil is very important, or some forces should be there to have the oil, but again, there is this confusion about the rhetoric on Syria from the foreign policy decision makers. and lack of strategy or kind of unpredictability about what US bureaucracy or the defense establishment is willing to do in the region. So there are too many risks not right now about the oil, and is it legal? Is it, like that's something that US supposed to do? What would be the reaction of the Syrians for this? What would be the outcome if Russia or Syrian regime is willing to do that? What will be the consequence of an attack towards the US forces by some other groups? Would it create another escalation that like happened in some other conflicts that US involved? So we have no clear idea about what US is willing to do. And in the future, if US is willing to have a strategy, and we know that both President Obama and President Trump didn't want to be in Syria, and ending endless wars can be understandable strategy given the geopolitical challenges that US is facing in different parts of the world. But having an exit strategy and leaving the regions should basically based on a plan that the region will not be more destabilized. There will be no more failed states. And in the end, there wouldn't be any situation that US had to intervene now by using more force in the future. So we don't see the exit strategy that will basically provide that clean exit and predictability of US policy. And in the future, what will be who will be the stakeholders in the region, and what would be the US relations with its allies? And Kadir is looking at me. I'll stop here and
Thank you, Kılıç. Mona, so Luke identified these goals, and Kılıç pointed out there is often we hear about the goals, but there is no strategy to make it happen. Elsewhere, you didn't mention it here, but you thought it was reasonable to work through local partners to achieve U.S. goals. And, without Luke pointed out, we don't need to have large military presence to achieve our goals. So maybe you can address that, like,
Sure.
Working with the local partners, as
Right.
opposed to Luke's points about forget about that, work with governments, etc.
So I think, thank you for the
Thank
question.
you.
So I think that, look, prior to October 6th, and maybe even prior to April of 2018, when frankly all of this discussion about a precipitous withdrawal of the US from Syria began with President Trump, there was a model on the ground in Syria that was developed by virtue of necessity, of working by, with, and through local partners, in this case, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, which had a significant Arab component, but certainly would not deny the Kurdish command element of them. Clearly, there were issues that all of us saw in government and outside of what future seeds of conflict and tension with Turkey this would bring. And I would agree, we're seeing a reckoning with that. What I would argue is that by, with, and through model was actually working quite well. It offered a creative approach, very different from the large deployments of US troops to Afghanistan and to Iraq in the early parts of the invasion. It was being undertaken with a minimal amount of resources. Again, not trillions of dollars, billions of dollars. Losing one US life in battle is one too many. But nonetheless, when one considers that there were 6 Americans lost, as opposed to over 10,000 Kurdish fighters, SDF fighters lost in the campaign against ISIS, it's clear that the United States was enabling a force on the ground that was bearing much of the cost of the battle. All of the territory in Syria was liberated, and we were embarked on the far more difficult challenge of stabilizing these areas. And I think what we learned in Iraq in 2011 is premature withdrawal, precipitous withdrawal, in the absence of stabilizing areas, setting the conditions for inclusive governance and other issues, will only lead to the resurgence of extremist groups in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually becomes ISIS. And now I think the concern, and it's a very real one, is that because of what's happened over the last month, the prospects for a renewed presence of ISIS, a resumption of ISIS or resurgence of ISIS in this area have only grown. They have not diminished. I would argue that there was a much more deliberate way to have managed the tensions with Turkey, while also ultimately negotiating a withdrawal of the U.S. from this area. No one envisions that the U.S. should have stayed in Syria forever. I would not argue that. I think what I would argue is that a precipitous withdrawal, such as the one we're seeing now, is the worst case. However, what's even more concerning is that we haven't even withdrawn. Now it appears as though, in fact, there may be the same number of forces on the ground as prior to October 6th, but the issues are their composition, their mission, which remains unclear, their rules of engagement, which are also unclear, where they're being deployed. So in effect, we're sort of in a lose-lose situation. And here I also have to push back a little bit on Luke in terms of there is absolutely great power competition taking place, not only in Syria, but much more broadly in the Middle East with Russia. And the pictures you saw, I think, are only emblematic, that is, of Russian flags now flying on former U.S. Outposts, are, I think, emblematic of a much bigger strategic concern, which is the ways in which Russia is exploiting the lack of clarity in our strategy and our withdrawal from Syria to fill the vacuum, to fill the void, in a way that signals others in the region as well about the extent of U.S. resolve. It was an odd coincidence that just after this withdrawal started to take place, President Putin was on a state trip to Saudi Arabia. In addition, we have the news today of a heightened Russian presence in Libya, in many ways modeled on what they were doing in Syria. So the Middle East is a region of great strategic importance to the United States. To cede these areas to Russia, I think, is a huge mistake.
Just a quick one. Resurgence of ISIS, even Baghdadi being killed, you don't factor that in? Or is
of course, no. Baghdadi's being killed is of course, a setback to the organization, no question about it. But I think we should be very careful about putting too much stock in a decapitation strategy without understanding, again, the ways in which these organizations are resilient, they're adaptive. In the case of ISIS, quite decentralized. We know that they have, emirates, as they call them, all throughout, frankly, globally. And again, I think what's really important on Syria is that even before the Turkish incursion started, we were already becoming more and more concerned about the proliferation of ISIS sleeper cells, about growing instability in areas that had been liberated from ISIS, and about the need to actually double down on our stabilization work, on our local governance work, and frankly, on the need to engage and address the issues that were coming to the fore by virtue of having Kurdish-led elements down in Arab-majority areas, down around Deir ez-Zor and elsewhere. Those were legitimate concerns in which if the aspirations of local populations weren't going to be fulfilled, if there was a feeling that now we're just being occupied by the Kurds as opposed to another force, that too is problematic. But what I would argue is we've actually given up the leverage and the influence we may have had to shape those things in a positive direction. And if anything, last point, by making oil part of the mission now, and by talking about the fact that we're going to ensure that the resources from that oil, it's not entirely clear what we're looking to do with the resources from the oil. But one notion is that it continues to flow to the SDF, to the Kurds. That's deeply problematic because one of the core grievances of local Arab populations in some of those regions is, in fact, a demand for a more equitable distribution of oil and other resources. So we are now actually deepening a grievance that potentially could, in fact, drive the kind of disaffection that leads local populations to perhaps turn back to groups like ISIS.
Thank you. Luke, Kılıç, did you have something on this specifically?
Go ahead.
No, please.
One thing, Mona, don't you think that is the actually the, you know, like that is the problem I see, you know, in the fight against ISIS and the support to YPG, we had this problem of there was a lack of strategy in Washington, D.C. And those who were running basically the operation on the ground against ISIS basically started to shape the policy. And when you let them to shape the policy, of course, they have a mission to defeat ISIS and they did it. But in the meantime, you don't see what could be the consequences of this to your broader regional policy or your relations with the allies. We see the same thing. You mentioned that there's a model and the model is working. Model used to be working. And now you are expecting that the model would shape the policy in the absence of a strategy. So those who are doing those models, in this instance, you know, like expected to shape the policy, which would be again a detrimental impact on your relation with your allies. I think that is the primary problem in U.S. foreign policy, U.S. policy towards Syria. In the absence of a strategy, top-down strategy that would clarify the goals, clarify the objectives, and determine the instruments that will be used, determine the resources that will be used in Syria, people on the ground is saying that, okay, this is working. Let's, you know, like this should be a spillover effect. Why don't we use this model to other places as well? I think that is one of the difficulties.
I would agree with, listen, Kılıç, I agree with you completely that the U.S. policy has been plagued by a lack of strategy and contradictory and conflicting objectives over the course of not one but two administrations. But the top priority with respect to our U.S. national security interests, which is protecting the homeland, was the enduring defeat of ISIS. And in that sense, that piece of the policy as being implemented on the ground was working. I don't think it's fair to blame those on the ground that were actually implementing and carrying out that piece of it for a lack of coherence and strategic foresight at the most senior levels of U.S. policymaking. The policy grew incredibly ambitious. You noted the 5 objectives, the countering of Iran, all kinds of things, without the means or the resources to undertake those objectives. And so I would say that what happened is that somewhere along the way we got lost in terms of where our policy towards Syria was going over the horizon. But there was something on the ground that was working. It had faults, as I've named. I want to be very clear. It had faults. But I would argue in the moment we had built up enough leverage and influence and we were beginning to address those issues. Now we have essentially dealt away any leverage, I would argue, that we may have had. And I'm actually much more concerned about instability, spillover, humanitarian catastrophe that has already, some of the humanitarian security and other implications that we're already seeing today.
So I kind of see a replay of the debates we've been having. So U.S. needs to protect the homeland, fight ISIS, and how does it do it, right? And then go through local allies, buy it through, or the state partners. So Luke, we'll have to bring you back on defending that position.
All right.
Can that be rebuilt? Like the leverage Mona is saying is now gone because we are not, pursuing that. Can that be built through the kinds of things you suggested, coordination with the states?
Well, as a general rule. I don't think in this day and age a terrorist organization has to own a piece of territory to be able to launch attacks. But what was unique about ISIS is that they had this ability to link theology with geography in a way that drove up recruitment in a big way. So they became very attractive by owning a big plot of land. I mean, let's not forget, that at the height, they owned a piece of territory that was the size of Maryland with the population of West Virginia. And they were able to use this as proof that, you know, they are establishing this caliphate. It's in line with the prophecies, and disgruntled people around the world thought, oh, I can rebuild my life and I'll go to the caliphate. So they had to be seen as defeated, territorially defeated, because they immediately lost their appeal. So I understand why they had to be territorially defeated. But I do not buy this notion that we have to maintain a military presence somewhere in the world to keep us safe here at home. Because perhaps they could plan an attack in Hamburg and then train for it in Florida, like was done on 9/11. We need to be a little more circumspect in terms of how we confront terrorism. Sometimes there's a military component. Most of the time it's going to be a law enforcement and an intelligence component. But I want to go back to the point about conceding this ground to Russia or handing Syria to Russia on a silver platter, or handing the Middle East. You see these headlines, Russia's the new power broker in the Middle East. I don't buy this for 1 second. Syria has always been in Russia's sphere of influence for decades, okay? And Russia is the single country on the UN Security Council that continuously gives Iran the diplomatic top cover it needs. It continuously gives Iran an outlet in which to bypass economic sanctions. So by supporting Bashar al-Assad and enabling him to continue the civil war in Syria, and by enabling Iran to do what it does, it is actually doing the most unpopular thing you can do in the Arab world. And yes, Putin visited Riyadh and Abu Dhabi recently, but that was the first visit of a Russian president in 12 years to these countries. So look, these countries know who butters their bread, and it's definitely not the Kremlin. And are these countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates going to pursue pragmatic relations with Russia? Yes. Does this mean that we're handing Russia the Middle East on a silver platter? No, it doesn't, because they're actually doing what is very unpopular, deeply unpopular across the region, and that is enabling Iran and enabling the continuing fighting in Syria. And I do want to also push back, and not really push back, but just play devil's advocate on this idea that a U.S. troop withdrawing our 2,000 troops from northeastern Syria is going to create the conditions for the resurgence of ISIS. Because it's really in nobody's interest that ISIS resurges for different reasons. But I think, I don't think the Assad regime, Russia, I don't think Turkey, I don't think the YPG, I don't think the local Arabs, I don't think it's in their interest for ISIS to resurge. So I just don't, we hear this a lot, that our withdrawal would automatically means a resurgence of ISIS. So you mean to tell me just like the 2,000 troops is the only thing holding ISIS down? I just don't see it. And this region of Syria will be stabilized. It might not be stabilized by US forces, but it is going to be stabilized one way or the other. And it may not be pretty, but that's going to be the reality. So again, I just don't necessarily buy that by leaving, we're giving ISIS like a fertilizer that it can quickly grow back.
Did you want to?
Just a quick, yeah. So I think it's important to understand that the 2,000 troops and then 1,000 troops were catalyzing 60,000 plus who were on the ground, holding 30% of Syrian territory that contains very valuable resources. But there's another piece to this that I think we need to understand, which is in this territory, is a chain of ISIS detention centers, pop-up prisons essentially, that are being guarded by our local Kurdish partners on the ground. There are an estimated 10,000 plus fighters in those prisons. Already some have escaped. The estimate is perhaps 100, maybe more. We don't really know. And Kurds have actually, unfortunately, been some of them pulled off of those guarding duties because they've gone to the front to fight for what they consider an existential battle with the Turkish incursion. In addition, there are displacement camps that hold women and children, families, some of whom are associated with ISIS, not all. Those numbers total about 90,000. One of those camps, Ain Issa, essentially collapsed due to artillery fire that came from the Turkish side. The guards left, and a number of people, hundreds, fled. We know that ISIS, in part, grew out of a strategy of prison breaks. And the likelihood that these prison breaks could happen has now increased by virtue of the fact that they are not able to be guarded as well. And so that in and of itself could help fuel a resurgence of ISIS. So again, I'm not trying to say 2,000 means no ISIS, but precipitous withdrawal, chaos, power vacuums, unaddressed grievances, and the potential for prison breaks, all of those things are a very potent mix. And I would disagree. I don't think this area of Syria is going to be stabilized for a long, long time.
Kılıç, how does Turkey sees its military operation there and how it can shape, help, or as has been discussed by many or proposed that it could derail the U.S. policy?
Just before that, I think I have to mention one thing that, everybody is talking about a sudden, the withdrawal of the troops or a major shock. But this was something that President Trump keeps talking since April 2018. Mm-hmm. I don't really understand why we call it a sudden decrease or, sudden withdrawal from Syria. So in December, after the phone call, he made this clear. Even the Secretary of Defense and Brad McGurk resigned. And he repeated this multiple different times that US is withdrawing. I look at and I see, at least 10, 15 tweets of the President Trump saying that we are withdrawing. And as far as I know, he is the President of the United States and he makes the decisions. And at this point, I am having a hard time to understand why it is a shocking, and destabilizing decision, in terms of the decision-making mechanism that would shock, the people on the ground. So this was something that has been decided for the last 18 months, as far as I understand. And a second thing, I understand the detention centers and everything, but it sounds to me very unsustainable to basically try to keep the ISIS prisons, or detention centers like this with the support of YPG. At this point, it looks, because we are talking about another armed group. And we are talking about an armed group which has serious problems with the Arab population on the ground, which has serious population with the neighboring states. So it becomes really, to keep it, I understand your logic, but it's very unsustainable in the long term to basically use the YPG as the only source of preventing resurgence of ISIS. And as Luke mentioned, it is a counterterrorism policy, and we are talking about a transnational group who can have different cells in different parts of the world, which needs more policing, more work on the financing of terrorism, more interaction among the intelligence agencies. And this is a different type of terror that can use cyber warfare, a lot of different options. So it's kind of, difficult to consider that YPG is the only savior of the US homeland or the homeland of other, the European countries or even Turkey from the ISIS attacks. That's hard to understand. This, on the part of Turkey, Turkey's operation was, here is the thing. Turkey, one thing was Turkey very consistent about the border security. And the safe zone discussion is going on for the last 5 years. when Steve Simon was in the NSC, actually, he offered this years ago about, creating a safe zone, because no-fly zone needs mandate. Let's have a safe zone. Then safe zone wasn't agreed upon. The ISIS zone, the terrorist zone, or they have different names for that zone. But Turkey was very clear that it wouldn't let terrorist groups, it considered YPG as a terrorist group, so it's a terrorist group for Turkey. So you cannot try to convince that, well, they are not terrorists. So if Turkey's national security concerns is regarding its border area and establishment of a statelet, a model statelet in its border, of course it will take steps. And nothing was surprising. So Turkey was the actor, that basically said what it will do. And then, to commit to that. In Jarablus operation, we see that. In Afrin operation, we saw that. And in multiple different instances, in Manbij operation, we saw that. And there was a serious kind of, the lack of trust when the Manbij roadmap didn't work. Because just like Pence and Pompeo visit to Turkey, in February 2018, we saw that Tillerson and McMaster came to Turkey in the same week. And Turkey was this is immediately after the Afrin operation, and Turkey was planning to have an operation in Manbij. And in June 2018, the roadmap plan about Manbij was signed on the understanding that there will be a timeline and there will be an expectation from Turkey that YPG will go back to the east of Euphrates. And this was promised by Vice President Biden. This was promised on the phone by President Trump. So each and every time, things didn't work out. So there was this concern on Turkey that if we reach an agreement on safe zone, which United States avoided to use the term until after Turkish operation, right? Only after Pence visit, we see for the first time the term called safe zone.
Although humanitarians, it is anything but safe.
Yeah.
And there is a reason that people don't use the term safe zone.
Okay, so, the idea was there, right? So it was at the beginning, it was humanitarian to keep the Syrian refugees over there, right?
Well, that's
and
problematic.
it didn't work out.
That's problematic.
It didn't work out.
Yeah.
So each and every time, Turkey was saying that we need a safe zone, and basically there was nothing surprising in Turkish operation. I don't know why many people in this town surprised, because there was military installations, and we see military movements in the border area. There were plans, there were newspaper reports about this that Turkey is planning to do. President Erdogan mentioned multiple times that Turkey will go in Syria, east of Euphrates. So I don't see, basically, many in this town kind of surprised about that, but I don't see any surprise. So it was basically the plan to clear the area from the terrorist groups. And then, if the reconstruction happens, like in Jarablus, in a limited sense, let some of the Syrian refugees to return to those lands.
Could I just,
Sure,
very quickly,
sure.
let me just, because you raised a number of points, Kilic. First of all, I completely agree with you that no one should have been surprised about President Trump's decision to withdraw the troops. You're absolutely right. He has been telegraphing this since April of 2018. The withdrawal itself, though, the implementation of this has been extremely precipitous and without a plan and chaotic and confused. And that's because, as I said, I think that there was a clear disconnect between policymakers at the State Department and Defense and the White House in terms of not taking the president at his word that he was serious about withdrawing. And as I said, much more could have been done strategically to have a withdrawal that was much more deliberate, that was much more planned, that was done in a way that would be consonant with U.S. national security interests. Second point, no one is saying that, the idea of the need for CT work and addressing ISIS-inspired attacks, the use of social media and other things, of course, those are all part of what has to be a multifaceted approach to countering a group like ISIS. But you also have to address their presence on the ground as well. Let us not forget that there was external operations planning going on from Syria that led to some significant attacks in Brussels, in Paris, et cetera. And by the way, that was part of the urgency that was felt by the Obama administration in terms of finding an appropriate local partner to work with us on the ground to counter ISIS. You're also correct that the Kurdish guarding of these ISIS detention centers is by no means sustainable, even had there been no incursion. And that speaks to a bigger issue, which is the refusal of our Western allies in particular to repatriate their fighters. That's a huge issue. I would argue there may be an opening now for this, because suddenly I think the world is confronted with exactly the prospect of prison breaks and uncontrolled repatriation of fighters. And so hopefully there's a silver lining that the global coalition and others can really begin to address this issue of the need to repatriate. Finally, on your point about Turkey, you're also very correct there, that President Erdogan has been crystal clear in his intentions, to include most recently at the UN General Assembly. I would lay down a marker of deep concern about the idea of pushing Syrian refugees currently in Turkey back into these parts of Syria, into Operation Peace Spring and other areas. Many of these areas are Kurdish majority areas. There is concern about forced return of Syrian refugees from Turkey into these areas. This is what's raising questions about forced displacement of Kurdish populations living in these areas, and even not only Kurdish populations, other minorities as well, Christian minorities and others that live in these areas. And this is raising this specter of ethnic cleansing. My final point is I don't think we needed to be where we are here. I think there are many other ways that the U.S., through diplomacy and other measures, could have, quite frankly, I think, addressed the YPG-PKK issue at its core, which really has to do with Turkey's concerns, understandable concerns about the PKK in Turkey, and the need to help reinvigorate some kind of negotiations, which were happening prior to 2015. And in addition, Turkey has done, and I've said this often, Turkey has done more than its share in terms of hosting Syrian refugees. It hosts the largest number of Syrian refugees of any country in the world, by stark comparison to the United States and the very few numbers of Syrian refugees that the US hosts. And that more needed to be done and needs to be done with respect to helping Turkey shoulder that burden. I know the Europeans have done quite a bit, but to, again, force Syrians back into areas which are not their areas of origin, in my mind, it does raise concerns about ethnic cleansing in Syria, and also, frankly, sows the seeds for more conflict down the road.
Luke, if you have, I want to turn to the audience, but if you wanted to add anything here, I'll let you talk. But otherwise, I want to go to our audience for questions. Yes. Do we have a microphone, guys?
If you could state your name and affiliation.
My name is William Church. I'm an independent researcher. So I only have about a 90-second comment, not really a question, but it leads to a question. So I somewhat support Mr. Coffey's view. And I think what he's saying is geopolitical power is a 19th century to mid to late 20th century concept in the US view. It makes no difference what the Russians do. I've been since I was 18 years old. I'm now in my 70s. I've seen this Cold War, this power play. It didn't work in Africa. It didn't work in Asia. It didn't work anywhere. In the end, the true regional powers control the result. And it's only delusional to think the United States can even have a role into that. So tell me whenever, as you said, they're raising flags in Poland, then I'll be concerned. Second, I've been cheek to jowl with terrorists and guerrilla forces since I was 18 years old, and I'm in my 70s now. You're not going to wipe them out, right? Ever. We need to deal with them as the exception that is the rule. So the delusion that somehow we can kill terrorists is absurd. What you do is deal with them, kill off terrorists, deal with them as they appear. And that's my 90-second comment, right?
There's some questions there, I guess. Is there? Yes. Luke, that was more for you. Right?
Thank you. Safan Alaberde from Anadolu Agency. Thank you for doing this. I have a quick question, actually. for especially for Mona and whoever wants to answer. Yesterday, President of Iraqi Kurdistan, Barzani, said PKK want to get legitimacy. PKK want to get legitimacy through Syrian Kurds, quote unquote disaster that happened there because of this wrong policy of U.S. And he also emphasized some local Kurdish leaders who were assassinated by the PKK and YPG. So my question is, yes, there are still sleeping cells of Daesh in Syria, but only emphasizing and focusing on Daesh, which has been defeated a while ago, do you think that it would undermine the local realities and problems and conflicts that caused by YPG, PKK in the region? Thank you. And why don't we ever talk about other Kurdish people in Iraq? Thanks.
Right behind Alex.
Hi, I'm Ken Meyer, Cord retiree. Doesn't the almost universal outcry against Trump's decision to withdraw, plus the fact that the withdrawal turned out to be pretty much a faux withdrawal, it seems we have more of a presence in Syria now than we did before we withdrew. And third, that no one's talking about us withdrawing from our base in southern Syria, suggests that the United States won't leave Syria until it's achieved victory.
Okay. Luke, let's start with you about the great power competition comment and suggestion that just manage terrorism, mostly affirming what you said, but
Yeah, I mean, I think if you took a diplomat from the 19th century, if you took a diplomat that from 1880 and a diplomat from 1980, and you cryogenically froze both of them, and you thawed them both out today, it would be the one from 1880 that would most recognize the world we're in. This multipolar world with different centers of power competing over different interests, not the bipolarity of the Cold War. So I completely agree with that. And I think it's, we're taking a while, it's a generational shift, I think, in our foreign policy mindset to adjust to this new multipolar world. We're getting there, it's just taking some time. On your point about, you can no more kill your way out of an insurgency than you can drink yourself out of alcoholism. There is a difference, I think, between insurgencies and terrorist organizations, and I think sometimes insurgencies can use terrorist tactics, but you have to, as was already mentioned, you have to deal with the underlying causes of what allows these groups to get popularity to begin with. And often it's like political grievances, economic grievances, social grievances, and you have to kind of confront it that way. Do you want me to just quickly go down the line?
If you want to address anything.
Yeah, and then the point by the second gentleman about the different Kurdish groups and our inability in the West to distinguish between them is, in my opinion, what got us into this mess to begin with. We treat the Kurds as if they're some monolithic group, all with the same ideological beliefs, goals, visions, and as was mentioned by Barzani yesterday or the day before, I mean, even the Iraqi Kurds understand that the Syrian Kurds, specifically the YPG, is not necessarily a partner for the KRG. And when all the commotion happened about the U.S. withdrawing and the Turkish incursion, I saw some crazy comments made by people who should know better. One very senior aide to the British Prime Minister tweeting, he's also a British Army veteran, tweeting out that he's fought with the Peshmerga in Iraq against ISIS, and now we're abandoning them. And I thought, my gosh, I mean, you have the Prime Minister's ear, and you're spouting this nonsense on Twitter. You should know better. We should know better. We should be a little more sophisticated on our understanding of the groups that we are arming. And we have essentially armed a neo-Marxist terrorist organization. Call me old-fashioned, but I don't find that very, I'm not very enthusiastic about that. And then on the final point about the U.S. presence in Syria means we haven't really left and we're going to stay until victory. Well, the Middle East is a place of many shades of gray. And I know as Americans, we instinctively like to view the world as being black or white. And there is not going to be victory as we understand it in the American sense in Syria for the United States, but there won't necessarily be defeat either. We have to look at our big strategic objectives, and we have to apply our national resources and arrange our policies to meet these objectives. And having the base at Al-Tanf does provide actually has a strategic impact in terms of the Iranian land bridge. That is a prime piece of real estate. But I'm sorry, but using tier 1 level special operators to guard oil derricks in northeastern Syria, in my opinion, is a waste of resources. And I do hope they remove these special operators and bring in, if we're going to go down this road of defending these oil fields, then we should do it with conventional forces. Again, as a former soldier, I could tell you, like the first task you're taught is how to guard something. So I think we could be a little more wiser on how we confront this mission if in fact we do decide to go down this road.
Thank you, Luke. Mona, the differences between Kurdish groups.
So that's a great question, and I think I agree in part with what Luke is saying. I mean, I think that the question points to the complexity of intra-Kurdish politics as well, and that in fact there were deep differences between the PYD, the political arm of the YPG, and KRG-related factions, and in fact, this was an issue that was being worked on in Track 2 negotiations, trying to actually begin to mend some of the intra-Kurdish issues that needed to be addressed. There are issues with the PYD, not only with respect to Arabs, but also with respect to other Kurds. And so, point taken, but I think the comments that you referenced aside, there have also been demonstrations and so forth in Iraqi Kurdistan in support of Syrian Kurds, which is interesting given that they're not protesting as other Iraqi brethren are about all the other issues, the kinds of protests, the very violent protests, violently put down protests that we're witnessing in Baghdad and further south. And so, interestingly enough, in some ways, this Turkish incursion has had the effect, I would argue, potentially of galvanizing Kurds who, in their complexity, had been opposed to one another prior.
Did you want to talk about, like, basically U.S. not fully withdrawing? It's going to be there forever until victory. But
Well, yeah,
what
I don't see that either. But again, I get my answer is in some ways the gentleman I think is talking again about this notion of the forever wars, and I would argue again that that there was a potential pathway out of these forever wars in the earlier pre-October 6 mission. And here I don't have any military experience, but so in ways I defer to Luke. But there was a very nuanced and complex set of folks operating on the ground inside Syria who were trained and had the capacity to deal with and understand the complexities of the situation on the ground. Replacing them with conventional forces in one of the most dangerous and complex conflict arenas in the world, I think is a big mistake. And again, even this idea of pivoting the mission to guarding oil installations, I think is entirely wrong-headed and is not going to really move us forward in any way.
Can I just add, I agree with that. I think we're now entering the worst of both worlds. Right. But if the mission is to continue a partnership with the SDF and the YPG, then for sure it has to be our special operators. This is like their bread and butter. This is what they do: train indigenous forces, fight alongside them. If the mission is now to guard an oil field, I think it's an absolute waste of our precious Tier 1 special forces to use them to do that when conventional forces could be used.
If I just one quick point on that, but the way it's, and again, I think partly we are all struggling with the fact that there is such a lack of clarity with respect to our mission on the ground. But part of the way in which it's being portrayed is that the guarding of the oil facilities is a way to maintain the partnership with the SDF. And so again, if that is the intent, and I would argue guarding oil installations or holding oil installations is not the best way to do this. But there is this notion in mind that somehow we are preserving the partnership with the SDF by doing this.
Kılıç, did you want to add anything
Yeah,
to this?
just a few things. One is about this geopolitical rivalry. I think we need to remember that there wasn't any golden age between Syria and United States, because when I see the the things that has been written, it is almost I'm expecting and who lost Syria.
Yeah, like it
debating
was
this
ours
down.
to begin with. Yeah.
It is. It has been on the state sponsoring terrorism list since 1979, and it has been one of the longest sanctioned country by the United States. So there should be, the clarity in mind that there has never been a, the U.S. military or political presence that would shape the balances of power in the Middle East, in Syria first. And the fact that Syria has never been a U.S. ally didn't change the fact that U.S. became the great power, superpower in the Cold War years. So we need to clarify that first. Secondly, I guess one thing about the Mona mentioned that there's a specter of ethnic cleansing debate. Because of that, it's specter. It is not realities on the ground. And you don't expect a country whose 15 to 20% of the population is Kurdish is attempting to ethnically cleanse Kurds from another part of the world. So it is, forget about everything on the ground. Domestically, it doesn't make sense for Turkey to do that. And thirdly, as all of us mentioned, the clarity is key here about the US policy. And in fact, we don't know that if President Obama still was the president today, if he would make the same decision or not, right? Because it was the President Obama's decision to leave Iraq. It was the President Obama's and Secretary Clinton's decision to end these endless wars and pivot to Asia. It was their idea that we should stop, these unconventional conflicts and focus on the great power rivalry again. So we don't, and I see this, all of the tweets from the former Obama, the people writing, on Syria, which, unfolded in their watch, which most of the humanitarian disaster happened actually under their watch. So I don't find that, there's something that is relevant about the Syria debate today. It is mostly about domestic political issue, and we know that the real specter that's haunting them is Syria. Because of that, everybody who wrote a book is saying that it is not my fault. I gave the advice to do something about that, but it didn't work out. So, including Secretary Clinton. So I think most of them are a little bit domestic politics debate. So Syria issue and the withdrawal and its geopolitical ramification became a bread and butter now for domestic politics, more than geopolitical consideration in the Middle East right now.
Mm-hmm. I just need to jump in on one thing. So your points are all well taken, Khalid, but I do think it's...
You always start the sentence like that, and you make me nervous.
Yeah, now you do need to be nervous because...
When you compliment, I see that there's something
I think, I use the word specter because we don't know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But we do know what happened in Afrin. And Afrin, which was a Kurdish-dominant enclave in northwest Syria, and this is international human rights organizations who have documented forced displacement of Kurds from those areas, abuses committed against them, raising the idea of war crimes, atrocities, and even ethnic cleansing. And unfortunately, this comes as part of a larger story in Syria of one of the many, many tragedies of this conflict, which is that of demographically re-engineering different parts of the country to suit the purposes of whomever is in control. And so we see it for sure along the western coast of Syria, with Sunnis essentially having been forced out of areas that are now Alawite dominant. We see it in the areas between Damascus and the border of Lebanon. We see it even inside Damascus with Shia and Iranians buying up real estate around Shia shrines. And unfortunately, we've also seen it in the northwest, in this Kurdish-dominant canton of Afrin, which in fact has been, in many ways, cleansed of its Kurdish inhabitants. Others have been put in. And this is precisely what is sparking the fears about what could happen in the Peace Spring area and other parts of northeastern Syria.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I want to put a challenge to our panel, because the title is Future of U.S. Policy in Syria, and Luke mentioned several goals, but I want one goal from you, because I think one is there's a tension, like confronting ISIS versus confronting great powers. The arena is Syria. We don't exactly seem to care about Syria's own. Yes, we do, but as experts, but the country's approach to this, ultimately, we don't see it as consequential to both ISIS fight and the great power competition for its own sake, perhaps. Maybe I'm wrong, but can you just say, okay, this should be the overarching goal of the U.S. in Syria, so we can finish on that note, perhaps. We'll start with you again, Mona.
I mean, in the confusion of where we are today,
We want your clarity.
it's very hard to outline a realistic posture for where the United States can go. Because, again, from my perspective, the preeminent national security objective in Syria has been the enduring defeat of ISIS.
Okay.
That objective has now been compromised seriously. We've also, unfortunately, given away the significant, I would argue, the significant leverage we still had to help shape a political settlement in Syria that would help bring this bloody conflict, now nearly a decade long, to an end. So I think at this point, our objectives have to be somewhat minimalist. I'm not sure exactly what we can be doing to continue to try and stabilize areas, again, with all the uncertainty, mind you, of where and how it is that the Assad regime and Russia begin to move into areas that were once held by the US. So Raqqa, for example, the former capital of the caliphate, the so-called caliphate, that may well redound to Assad regime control, which is going to have a whole slew of issues related to that. So I guess what I would argue is the extent to which we are able to somehow leverage the little bit that we have left in Syria with this current residual force, as well as, I would argue, through diplomacy, really beginning to drill down on the issue of repatriation, both of fighters, but also, frankly, from a purely humanitarian standpoint, of the many children, the many orphans who are literally stranded in Syria, to work with our allies, to work through the coalition, to make that an objective, repatriation, return, and to also, quite frankly, support communities, in particular in Iraq, where there are large numbers of Iraqis currently in Syria. I think the number is maybe 30,000 civilians. And Iraq, understandably, somewhat reluctant to take them back with no real plan. So I think much more can be done to help with the return of these families, to help with reconciliation of ISIS families with their local communities, to help build the resilience of local communities in Iraq. These are areas where the U.S. still has purchase. We still have a stake in which I think we can make a real difference on the ground. I'm unfortunately, less optimistic about that inside Syria.
Okay. Thank you, Mona. Luke.
Well, my starting point, as I already mentioned, is the belief that the situation is so bad and has become so bad over the years that the U.S. is very limited in what it can actually do to achieve an acceptable end to the civil war. So my starting point, because of that, is to the best of our ability as a nation, working with our regional partners to keep what happens in Syria inside Syria to the best we can. And then to protect our homeland and the homeland of countries that we're obligated to do through treaty obligations. Look, I don't see how the U.S. has any significant leverage to bring the civil war to an end. yes, we worked very closely with the YPG and the Syrian Kurds, but are we suggesting that we would become their advocate in future negotiations? I mean, is this a temporary tactical measure, or are we getting married? Because this is more of like a girlfriend type thing and not a marriage thing, in my opinion. And we need to be realistic about this. Are we going to create and establish a Syrian protectorate or a Kurdish protectorate in northeastern Syria forever? Because we've talked here for almost an hour and a half as if we're this close to solving the civil war in Syria, and we haven't even mentioned the word Idlib once. We are miles away from any sort of political settlement, power sharing, negotiated outcome of the civil war. And we should realize this. We should realize our limitations as a nation and focus very narrowly on what we can do and how we can achieve it. And that is protect the homeland and protect our allies. And so that's my one goal for the U.S. is to protect the homeland and that of our allies.
Thank you, Lou.
I think I agree with them, but one thing is I think U.S. needs to invest more on the diplomatic side of the negotiations. They still have leverage. They still control the airspace. They still have the basically servicemen on the ground. So I think it would be a good way to kind of, like to create a proportional impact on the diplomacy that United States has been creating in the military field. So it is important for United States from now on to focus more on to find out if there is any solution and if United States can contribute for this solution in the diplomatic sense. I think that would be the key. The continuing the status quo on the ground, as we understand with the U.S. relations with YPG, it will basically, it is not sustainable. Even if it is, if it will be permanent, there should be some kind of explanation from the U.S. side, how they will control this. They keep saying that this is the most effective fighting force, but they forget that they become effective by fighting against a NATO ally for the last 30 years. So it is a challenging situation.
Because of U.S. air support.
Yeah, air support as well. So it is important to understand that in this and under these conditions, any model that YPG or SDF, like whatever you call is heading is not sustainable for the long-term policy. And if we want a solution in Syria, United States should be big in the diplomatic sense to pursue these negotiations and start initiatives about that.
Well, thank you for those comments and excellent, arguments. And I think we got a good diversity of voices here, and we had a great discussion. I really appreciate all of you being here this morning and our audience too. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.
Thanks.